The autumn wind carried a smell of smoke and desperation across the muddy field outside Independence, Missouri. Canvas wagons circled up, their wheels caked in the red clay that would soon be the only color these families saw for 2,000 miles. You could hear kids laughing, the lowing of oxen, and the sharp crack of a whip as a man tested his gear one last time. But right in the middle of all that noise, there were three broken souls nobody saw. A wagon train leader, Captain Daniel Harrison, his calloused hands shaking as he stared at a bottle of whiskey. Two newborn babies, wrapped in a tattered quilt, their cries so weak they barely cut the air. And a well-dressed woman, her arms empty, aching with a loss that had haunted her for 7 long years. Captain Daniel Harrison was a man who'd led 4 successful trips to California. At 35, he was tall, quiet, and moved like a man used to making decisions that kept people alive. He commanded respect not by shouting, but by being right when it mattered. Today should have been just another departure. Final checks, last-minute fixes, the whole dance of moving 200 people across an entire continent. But it wasn't. Instead, Daniel stood outside his tent, a tent that had become both a nursery and a tomb, staring at 2 tiny faces he couldn't stand to look at and couldn't bring himself to leave behind. They were born just 3 days ago. The storm that brought them was the worst Missouri had seen in a decade. Lightning split the sky while his wife, Catherine, screamed through 18 hours of labor. The rain leaked through the canvas, mixing with her sweat. The doctor, William Peterson, did everything he could, but Catherine was weak. Months of hard travel had worn her down. She lived just long enough to hold them. Thomas, she'd whispered, for your grandfather, and Elizabeth for mine. Then she looked at Daniel, not with anger, but with a deep, weary sadness for all the dreams they'd never see. Take care of them, Danny, she'd whispered. Promise me they'll know they were wanted. And he'd promised. What else could he do? But in the 3 days since he'd buried his wife in that same red clay, Daniel had learned the impossible weight of that promise. The wagon train had to leave at dawn. Caring for infant twins while leading an expedition through hostile territory, over mountains and across raging rivers, was impossible. The other families had their own kids to worry about. A woman named Martha Wellington offered to help with feeding, but she already had 4 of her own. The doctor suggested finding a wet nurse in town, but no respectable woman wanted to sign up for a dangerous 2,000-mile journey to care for motherless babies. That left Daniel with choices that made his stomach twist into knots. He could abandon the expedition and his entire career, stay in Missouri and try to raise them alone. He could take them on the trail and hope for the best, knowing their cries would be a dinner bell for predators and war parties, and that their needs would put every single person on that train in danger. Or he could do the one thing that felt like betraying Catherine's last wish, but might be their only chance to live. Just then, his friend Samuel Morrison walked up. Samuel was older, 42, with graying hair and the steady eyes of a man who'd seen the world for what it was. The Hendersons are asking when we're leaving, Samuel said quietly. Folks are getting anxious. If we don't leave soon, we'll be racing winter to the mountains. Daniel just nodded. He'd been saying soon for 3 days. But he had no idea how to settle anything. Every option felt like a failure. Samuel put a hand on his shoulder. Danny, you can't keep putting this off. Those babies need more than you can give them out here. And these families, they need a leader who isn't torn in half. I know, Daniel's voice was raw. I know what I have to do. Catherine made me promise. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Catherine was a good woman, but she was dying. She couldn't have known what you'd be facing. Sometimes keeping a promise means finding a different way to honor it. Before Daniel could answer, a commotion erupted near the supply wagons. Raised voices, a crowd gathering. Daniel was almost grateful for the distraction. He walked toward the noise and saw a burly blacksmith named James Mitchell, red in the face, yelling at a well-dressed woman Daniel didn't recognize. "I paid good money for this train," Mitchell roared. "I didn't pay to be delayed while our so-called leader sorts out his personal problems." The woman, who Daniel now realized was Eleanor Phillips, a widow who joined at the last minute, stood her ground. She was about 30, with chestnut hair and a fine dress that, even caked in mud, looked expensive. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice calm but firm, with a soft Virginia accent. "I hardly think 3 days is an unreasonable delay, given the tragic circumstances." Mitchell just snorted. "Tragic or not, this is business. Harrison should have planned better. Found someone to take those babies. Now we're all paying for his mistake." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, because they were true. He had failed. "That's enough, Mitchell," Daniel said, stepping forward. The crowd parted for him. "The delay is my responsibility. I'll resolve it today." But before Mitchell could argue, Eleanor Phillips spoke again. "Captain Harrison," she said, her tone urgent. "Might I have a word with you privately?" There was something in her eyes, not pity, but a kind of quiet intensity that made Daniel nod. He led her away from the crowd, down by the creek. They walked in silence until they were out of earshot. Then she turned to face him. "I understand you're facing a difficult decision about your children," she said, getting straight to the point. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's a private matter, Miss Phillips." "Miss Phillips," she corrected him gently. "And ordinarily, it would be. But I've overheard the talk. People are saying you'll have to leave them at an orphanage." The word orphanage landed like a physical blow. Daniel knew what they were like on the frontier. Warehouses for unwanted children. Finding a good family to take twins would be impossible. He tried to speak, but she held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I have a proposition." Eleanor took a deep breath, and for the first time, Daniel saw her hands were trembling. "I've been married twice, Captain Harrison," she began, her voice softer now, vulnerable. "Both husbands were good men. We wanted children desperately. We tried for 7 years with my first husband before he died. 3 years with my second before he was taken too. I've seen every doctor from Richmond to Chicago. I've prayed until my knees were raw." She looked out at the muddy creek. "I am 31 years old, Captain, and I've accepted that I will never bear children of my own. But that does not mean I have stopped wanting to be a mother." A tiny flicker of light appeared in the darkness that had surrounded Daniel for 3 days. "What are you proposing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Let me adopt your children," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Legally, formally, with proper papers drawn up. I have the money to care for them. My second husband left me very well off. I have experience with children, and I'm already committed to this journey. You wouldn't be leaving them behind with strangers." The offer was so perfect, so impossibly convenient, that it made Daniel suspicious. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you take on such a burden? The trail is dangerous." Eleanor's smile was sad, but genuine. "Because those babies are everything I've wanted my entire life. Because raising them would give meaning to a journey I'm only taking, because I have nowhere else to go. And because," she hesitated, then met his gaze with absolute conviction, "I believe God sometimes arranges circumstances that seem tragic, so that people who need each other can find one another." Daniel studied her face, looking for any hint of a lie, any hidden motive. All he saw was a woman who had known loss, but hadn't let it break her. A woman who reminded him, painfully, of Catherine. "The trail is brutal," he said, testing her. "We'll face disease that kills healthy men in days. Hostile tribes that won't care if they're babies. Are you prepared for that?" "I've read every account of this journey I could find," she replied without flinching. "I know the risks, but families make this trip every year with small children. With proper care, your twins can survive." Just then, a cry drifted from his tent. Elizabeth, hungry, overdue for a feeding. The constant, crushing demands of caring for them were exhausting him. "I need to," he started, gesturing toward the tent. "May I come with you?" Eleanor asked. "I'd like to meet them." Against his better judgment, he nodded. They walked back through the camp in silence. The tent felt like a tomb. Catherine's things were still there. On the quilt, the twins lay crying. Thomas, the bigger one, was red-faced and angry. Elizabeth, smaller and frailer, cried with a desperate, weak sound that tore at Daniel's heart. Eleanor stepped inside and went straight to them. She moved with the confidence Daniel had been faking for 3 days. She picked up Elizabeth, cradling her against her shoulder, rocking gently until the cries quieted. "Hello, little one," she murmured. Then, with her free hand, she stroked Thomas's forehead until his cries subsided into whimpers. Daniel watched, stunned. She soothed them both at once, a feat of magic he couldn't comprehend. "They're beautiful," Eleanor said, looking up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "They have your bones, but I see their mother in Elizabeth's chin and in Thomas's eyebrows." The comment hit Daniel hard. He'd been so consumed by the work of keeping them alive, he hadn't let himself truly see them, to see Catherine in their tiny faces. "She wanted them so much," he said, his voice thick. "She used to talk to them for hours before they were born, telling them all about the life we were going to build in California." He found himself telling this stranger everything, about Catherine's dreams for a school, her hopes for her children. "She made me promise they'd know they were wanted," he finished, the words catching in his throat. "Then that is exactly what I will make sure they know," Eleanor said firmly. "Every single day of their lives, they will know they were conceived in love, born to parents who treasured them, and chosen by someone who sees them as the greatest blessing she could ever receive." The absolute conviction in her voice, mixed with her own desperate hope, broke through Daniel's doubt. This wasn't charity. This was a woman who had found the one thing she'd been searching for her entire life. "There would have to be legal papers," he said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Proper adoption." "I have money, Captain Harrison," she said. "More than enough. I want this to be legal and binding. I want to be their mother in every sense of the word." Daniel looked at the twins, now sleeping peacefully in her arms, and for the first time in 3 days, he felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to lift. A flicker of hope. "The train leaves at dawn," he said. "Is that enough time?" Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, Daniel saw pure joy on her face. "Captain Harrison, I have been waiting 7 years for this moment. I'll have everything arranged by sunset." Just then, Samuel appeared at the tent flap. "Danny, we need to—" He stopped, taking in the scene. Eleanor, holding both babies like she was born to do it. "Samuel, meet Miss Eleanor Phillips," Daniel said, feeling lighter than he had in months. "She's going to adopt Thomas and Elizabeth." Samuel's eyebrows shot up, but his face quickly flooded with relief. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze assessing. "Miss Phillips, are you certain you understand what you're taking on?" Eleanor looked from the babies back to Samuel, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Morrison, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. These children need a mother, and I need to be their mother. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem appears out of nowhere." Inside that small tent, a new family was being forged, not by blood, but by desperate need and a hope that defied all reason. The twins slept on, as if they knew their future had just been saved. Daniel looked at the woman who was taking on the greatest responsibility imaginable, and he allowed himself to believe that he could keep his promise to Catherine after all. Tomorrow, they would finally head west. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Eleanor Phillips clutched a satchel full of legal papers. Beside her, Daniel Harrison shifted uncomfortably in a suit that felt like a costume after months on the trail. Back in a hotel room, Martha Wellington watched over the sleeping twins, who were oblivious to the fact that their entire lives were being rewritten. Eleanor had worked through the night. Her late husband's lawyer had pulled strings, and a series of urgent telegrams and generous donations had sped up a process that should have taken months. Now sitting in the judge's mahogany-paneled office, Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Judge Harold Blackwood, a stern-faced man with bushy white eyebrows, looked at her over his spectacles. "Miss Phillips, I must say, this is highly irregular. Are you absolutely certain you've considered all the implications?" Eleanor sat up straight. "Your Honor, I have spent 7 years considering the implications of becoming a mother. The only thing irregular here is the timing, not my commitment." The judge turned to Daniel. "Captain Harrison, I understand your situation is difficult, but signing away your parental rights is permanent. Once these papers are filed, they will no longer be your children in the eyes of the law." Daniel's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. He struggled for a moment, then his voice came out, steady but rough with grief. "Your Honor, my wife made me promise our children would know they were wanted. The best way I can keep that promise is to ensure they have a mother who can give them the love and care they deserve. Miss Phillips can give them what I cannot." For the next hour they signed a mountain of documents. Eleanor's hand trembled as she signed her new name for the first time. Eleanor Phillips, legal mother to Thomas Daniel Phillips and Elizabeth Catherine Phillips. Daniel signed away his rights, though he would still be their protector as the Wagon train leader. The final document was a trust fund, funded entirely by Eleanor's inheritance, to provide for the twins' future. The judge's eyebrows rose at the amount, but Eleanor had insisted. These children would want for nothing. "Well," the judge said, leaning back, "this is certainly the most unusual adoption I've ever processed, but everything appears to be in order. Miss Phillips, you are now their mother. Captain Harrison, you have fulfilled your obligations. I wish you all safe travels." Outside they stood in an awkward silence. In less than a day, Eleanor had the family she'd dreamed of, and Daniel had made the hardest decision of his life. "We should get back," Daniel said finally. "The train has to leave." As they walked through the dusty streets of Independence, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. Other families were loading their wagons, saying their goodbyes. Children were running and laughing, unaware of the dangers ahead. At the hotel, Martha Wellington met them with a look of relief. She handed Elizabeth to Eleanor with practiced ease. "They're good babies," Martha said. "Elizabeth is a bit fussier, but she settles once she's fed. Thomas just sleeps." Eleanor cradled Elizabeth, marveling at the warmth of the tiny body, the sweet smell of her skin. For 7 years she had imagined this moment. It was everything she had dreamed, and it was utterly overwhelming. "What supplies will they need?" Eleanor asked, her practical side taking over. Martha and Daniel exchanged a look, and Eleanor realized just how much she didn't know. The list was endless. Extra blankets, special foods, medicines, and most critically, a way to feed them. "I've been nursing them since Catherine died," Martha explained gently. "But my own baby is only 6 months old. I can't manage 3. Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment. In her rush to become a mother, she'd overlooked the most basic life-or-death details. "What are our options?" she asked, determined to find a solution. "There's a woman, Rebecca Foster," Daniel said. "She lost her own baby 2 weeks ago. She might be willing to help nurse." The next hour was a blur of frantic preparation. Daniel arranged to have Eleanor's wagon modified for better protection. Dr. Peterson examined the babies and declared them healthy, but gave her a stark warning. "Infants are vulnerable," he said, his tone professional and direct. "You'll need to watch them constantly. Keep them warm and dry, no matter what. Be prepared to make difficult decisions if they get sick." Eleanor nodded, the romantic idea of a journey west evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard understanding of the dangers. As the wagon train finally began to roll out of Independence, Eleanor sat in her wagon, Thomas and Elizabeth sleeping in a specially built crib. Through the canvas opening, she could see Daniel on his horse, leading them into the wilderness. The first day was harder than she could have imagined. The constant motion of the wagon made caring for the babies nearly impossible. The noise of creaking wheels and shouting men agitated them. By afternoon, both twins were crying inconsolably, and Eleanor's anxiety grew with every wail. Martha Wellington rode alongside when she could, offering advice, but she had her own family to manage. Other women offered sympathy, but they were too busy with their own struggles to offer real help. That evening, as they made their first camp, Eleanor struggled to set up a routine. The simple act of heating water to wash diapers became a monumental task. As darkness fell, a young woman approached her campfire. She was pale, with the hollow eyes of someone still deep in grief. It was Rebecca Foster. "Mrs. Phillips," she said quietly, "I understand you might need help with the babies. I still have milk. It seems a waste when these little ones need it." Tears of gratitude sprang to Eleanor's eyes. "Miss Foster, I would be so grateful. I'm still learning so much." What followed was Eleanor's first lesson in frontier survival. You don't do it alone. Rebecca took over the nighttime feedings for Elizabeth, while Eleanor managed Thomas. Other women, seeing Rebecca step up, began to contribute in small ways, offering knowledge, supplies, a helping hand. Before making his rounds, Daniel stopped by her campfire. His expression was worried. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor looked down at Thomas, finally asleep in her arms. Across the fire, Rebecca was gently rocking Elizabeth. The day had been overwhelming, filled with moments where she questioned her own ability. But holding Thomas, feeling his tiny hand grip her finger with absolute trust, she knew. "No second thoughts," she said firmly. "Just a steep learning curve. I didn't realize how much I didn't know." Daniel nodded, his expression softening. "Catherine used to say motherhood was like learning a foreign language, while someone's life depended on your fluency." Eleanor knew exactly what he meant. Every cry was a word she was just beginning to understand. As the campfire burned low, she settled the twins in their crib. She was no longer facing the challenge alone. She had found a partner in Rebecca. She had the support of other women. She had a community. The journey ahead was long and dangerous, but for the first time, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The third week of October brought a relentless, soul-crushing rain. The Kansas prairie turned into a sea of mud that threatened to swallow the wagon's whole. Inside her wagon, Eleanor pulled an oilskin cloak tighter around herself. Thomas and Elizabeth were miserable, fussing constantly in the damp cold that seeped through every blanket. Their tiny hands were perpetually cold, and a rattling sound had developed in their chests that made Dr. Peterson frown every time he checked on them. "We need to find shelter soon," Rebecca Foster said, quietly from the other side of the wagon. She had become Eleanor's shadow, her partner in this impossible task. "This dampness is dangerous for them." Eleanor nodded grimly, watching Daniel on his horse, soaked to the bone, shouting orders to keep the train moving. They were making barely 5 miles a day. Tempers were short, food was spoiling. And then, the crisis she had been dreading finally arrived. On a gray Thursday morning, Thomas woke with a raging fever. His little body felt like a furnace against her palm, and his breathing was shallow and labored. It reminded Eleanor terrifyingly, of her second husband's last days. "Dr. Peterson," she screamed, her voice filled with a panic she couldn't hide. "I need help." The doctor arrived in minutes, his expression serious as he examined the listless baby. Eleanor watched his face, searching for any sign of hope, but saw only the careful mask of a man who had delivered too much bad news. "It's pneumonia," he said, his voice gentle but direct. "The damp and cold have overwhelmed his system. Elizabeth is showing early signs as well." The world seemed to tilt. "What can we do?" Eleanor pleaded. "There has to be something." Dr. Peterson was already mixing herbs and camphor. "We'll do everything we can, but you need to understand the reality. Infants die from this even in the best of circumstances, and these are far from the best." The words were like a physical blow, but she forced herself to focus. "Tell me what to do," she said. "I'll do anything." The next 48 hours were a living nightmare. She and Rebecca kept a constant vigil, using steam from boiled water to ease the baby's breathing, forcing tiny drops of medicine between their lips, watching every flutter of their eyelids, every shallow breath. The community, which had been wary, began to rally. Martha Wellington organized a rotation of women to cook and do laundry, so Eleanor and Rebecca could focus entirely on the twins. Samuel Morrison made sure Eleanor's wagon was placed in the center of the train each day, protecting it from the worst of the jolting. Even James Mitchell, the blacksmith who had complained so loudly in Independence, quietly left a pile of extra firewood by her wagon to help keep the babies warm. Daniel appeared several times a day, his usual authority replaced by a helpless anguish as he watched his biological children fight for their lives. On the second night, he stood in the rain outside her wagon. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor looked up from where she sat holding Thomas. His fever had finally broken, but he was terrifyingly weak. "You're already helping," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "By keeping this train moving, by making the decisions I can't. This is what we agreed to. You lead, and I care for the children." He looked at her, the internal battle between his duty and his fatherly instinct clear on his face. But he nodded. "They're strong," he said quietly. "They have Catherine's stubbornness. They'll fight." And they did. By the fourth day, both babies were breathing easier. Dr. Peterson declared them past the worst of it, though he warned they would be weak for weeks. The crisis had forged new bonds, but it was an unlikely ally who made the biggest difference. A small 8-year-old Chinese girl named Mary Chun, whose family worked as cooks, appeared at the wagon with a steaming bowl of soup. "My grandmother's recipe," Mary said in careful English, her eyes shy but determined. "Good for sick babies." Eleanor tasted it, a complex broth of ginger and herbs that felt like medicine. She offered a tiny spoonful to Thomas, and he took it eagerly, the first food he'd shown interest in for days. "This is wonderful," Eleanor said. "Will you teach me how to make it?" Mary's face lit up. "You want to learn Chinese cooking?" "I want to learn anything that will keep them healthy," Eleanor replied. What started as a cooking lesson became something more. Mary knew an incredible amount about herbal remedies and infant care, knowledge passed down through generations. Her family's experience with survival was a world away from Eleanor's Virginia upbringing, and it was invaluable. But Mary's help also brought unforeseen conflict. The Chun family was viewed with suspicion by some. One afternoon, Mrs. Henderson, a banker's wife, made a sharp comment about foreign influences around the children. Eleanor's response was swift and cold. "Mary Chun's knowledge has probably saved my children's lives," she said, her voice carrying across the campfire with an authority that silenced everyone. "Consider myself fortunate to have her guidance." Anyone who questions it is welcome to care for sick infants using only their own methods. The confrontation did two things. It cemented Eleanor's position as a leader among the women, and it shielded the Chun family from further hostility. She was learning to use the social skills of a Virginia drawing room to fight battles on the frontier. As the weather cleared and the wagon train pushed on, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed. The terrified new mother had been replaced by a woman who could make life or death decisions with calm competence. The babies had changed too. Thomas was becoming a robust, happy baby. Elizabeth was quiet and observant, with an intensity that reminded Eleanor of herself. They knew her voice, her touch. They were bonding. She was no longer an outsider. She was a mother, a friend, a respected member of a community forged in crisis. That evening, Daniel stopped by her campfire with a bottle of brandy he and Samuel had been saving. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, accepting a cup of coffee. "For everything. Catherine would have been proud of the mother you've become." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "I had help," she said. "More help than I ever expected." "That's what makes this work," Daniel replied, gesturing to the circle of wagons. "Not one person's strength, but all of us, supporting each other." As if on cue, Elizabeth started to cry. Without a word, Rebecca set aside her mending and picked up the baby, settling into the familiar rhythm of a nighttime feeding. Eleanor watched her and Mary and felt a deep satisfaction. They had become her family. The journey ahead was still full of dangers, but she no longer faced them alone. The Platte River stretched before them like a wide brown snake, its calm surface hiding currents that could drag a wagon under in seconds. Eleanor stood on the bank, holding Thomas, while Elizabeth slept in Mary Chun's arms. She watched as Daniel and Samuel waded into the murky water, testing the crossing point they'd scouted for 3 days. It was November now. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, a winter they were racing to beat. The river was one of the last great obstacles before the mountains. "Current stronger than it looks," Daniel called back, the water up to his waist. "We'll need to double-team the oxen." Eleanor's stomach clenched. The babies had been thriving, growing strong and healthy. The thought of plunging them into that treacherous water filled her with a primal fear she was still learning to control. "Mrs. Phillips," a man named Jacob Hendricks called out. "We'll modify your wagon first, raise the bed, seal every gap. We'll keep the babies dry." The next few hours were a masterclass in frontier engineering. Hendricks and his sons worked with Samuel to waterproof her wagon. Martha Wellington organized the women into teams. Mary Chun appeared at her side with a bundle of oiled cloth. "My family crossed many rivers," she said. "Water spirits are dangerous with little ones. We make special protection." Mary carefully wrapped each baby in waterproof coverings, a technique passed down through generations, leaving just enough room for them to breathe. Dr. Peterson arrived with his medical bag in a waterproof case, his expression grim. "River crossings are where we lose people," he said quietly. "If something goes wrong, I might not be able to reach you. You need to be prepared to handle emergencies on your own." He pressed a small medical kit into her hands, with instructions for treating hypothermia and drowning. The honesty was terrifying, but Eleanor appreciated it more than false reassurance. At dawn, the crossing began. It was a carefully choreographed operation. Strong swimmers were positioned downstream. Ropes were stretched between the banks. Eleanor's wagon was scheduled to go in the middle of the pack. She watched as the first wagons lurched into the water, the river pushing against them, the oxen straining. Then, disaster struck. The Henderson family's wagon was mid-river when Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who'd been so critical of Mary, lost her footing. A single scream, and she was gone, swallowed by the brown water. Horror ripped through the crowd. Daniel spurred his horse into the current, diving from the saddle. For agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then he surfaced, dragging Mrs. Henderson's limp body. On the bank, Dr. Peterson worked frantically. Finally, she coughed up river water, alive but terrified. The incident was a brutal reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. "Your turn, Eleanor," Martha Wellington said gently, her voice steady. "Remember, the babies can sense your fear. Stay calm." Eleanor took a deep breath and climbed into the wagon. Mary was beside her. Rebecca Foster took the reins, her face set with determination. The wagon plunged into the river. The water was cold, the current a powerful living thing. Water began to seep through the floorboards, but it was manageable. The real danger came at the deepest part of the channel. The left wheels dropped suddenly, and the wagon tilted at a sickening angle. Water poured in, cold and fast. "Hold them steady," Rebecca shouted over the roar of the river. Eleanor clutched both babies to her chest, her heart pounding. The wagon tilted further, groaning, threatening to go over completely. "Rope coming across!" It was Daniel's voice, cutting through the chaos. "Grab it!" A rope, thrown by Samuel from the far bank, landed in Rebecca's outstretched hands. With the line to steady them, she expertly guided the oxen through the treacherous channel and up the opposite bank. When the wagon finally rolled onto solid ground, Eleanor's legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The babies, incredibly, were calm, protected by her embrace. But she knew how close they had come. "Well done," Daniel said, appearing at her side. "You kept your head when it mattered." "I had good help," she managed, her voice trembling. The rest of the crossing was tense, but uneventful. That night the camp was subdued, but something had shifted. Mrs. Henderson, humbled and grateful, came to Eleanor's campfire. "I was wrong," she said, her voice stiff with pride and shame. "To question your judgment about the Chun family. Mary's knowledge and Captain Harrison's courage, they saved us today." Eleanor accepted the apology. The old divisions of class and background were dissolving, replaced by the simple reality of survival. Later that evening, a new tension gripped the camp. A group of Pawnee warriors appeared at the edge of the firelight. Daniel and Samuel went to meet them, unarmed, while the rest of the train watched in nervous silence. Eleanor's first instinct was to hide the babies, but Mary stopped her. "They are not here to fight," Mary said quietly, studying the warriors. "They come to trade. It is business, not war." Mary was right. The Pawnee were seeking goods for safe passage, but they also brought valuable information about the weather in the mountains ahead. During the negotiations, a young warrior noticed Thomas's bright hair. He walked over to the wagon. Eleanor tensed, but Daniel gave a slight nod. The warrior spoke to Daniel, then looked at Eleanor. "He says your children have strong spirits to survive the river," Daniel translated. "He's offering a blessing for their journey." Eleanor nodded, moved by the unexpected kindness. The warrior performed a brief ceremony with sage and smoke, his words a soft chant in the cold night air. When the Pawnee left the next morning, the wagon train was different. They had survived the river. They had made peace with the people whose land they were crossing. And Eleanor realized that protecting her children wasn't just about keeping them warm and dry. It was about teaching them to navigate a world of unexpected dangers and unexpected grace. The first snowflakes fell on a gray December morning as they struggled up the rocky slopes of the Colorado Territory. They were 3 mountain passes from their destination, and winter was closing in. Eleanor walked beside the wagon, her breath turning to frost in the thin, cold air. Thomas was bundled in her arms. Elizabeth was inside the wagon with Mary, wrapped in a buffalo hide. The babies were nearly 6 months old, growing and thriving, but the mountains were a harsh nursery. Their food supplies were running low. Hunting was impossible in the deep snow. Daniel rode up, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "There's a situation." That evening, he called a meeting. The faces around the campfire were gaunt and worried. "I won't sugarcoat it," Daniel began. "We're 3 weeks behind schedule. We have enough food for 10 days if we ration strictly." A murmur of fear went through the group. Samuel Morrison spread a map. "The northern pass is blocked by snow. The southern route takes us through hostile Ute territory. The middle pass is our only option, but it requires leaving behind anything that isn't absolutely essential for survival." Eleanor knew immediately what that meant. Furniture, books, family heirlooms. Everything that connected them to the lives they had left behind. "How much weight do we need to shed?" James Mitchell asked. "Half," Daniel replied bluntly. "Maybe more. Every wagon carries only food, medicine, and basic tools. Everything else stays here." The silence was broken by the sound of a woman sobbing. Eleanor thought of her own wagon, the baby supplies, the few precious books she had brought from Virginia. Martha Wellington spoke up. "What about the children? The babies? They need more, not less." Rebecca Foster, ever their advocate, added, "Mrs. Phillips is caring for infants. We can't expect her to make the same cuts as everyone else." Eleanor was grateful, but she saw the resentful looks from some of the other families. The unity they had forged was starting to crack under the strain of starvation. "Everyone inventories their possessions tonight," Daniel said. "Decide what you cannot live without. Remember, we're not just trying to reach California. We're trying to reach it alive." The next morning was heartbreaking. Eleanor laid out all her belongings in the snow, sorting them into piles: essential, important, expendable. The expendable pile grew larger and larger. Mary Chun worked beside her, her practicality ruthless. "This dress, too heavy. This pot, we have another. These books." She hesitated. "They're heavy," Eleanor admitted. "And the babies can't eat poetry." Rebecca came over. "Maybe we can consolidate," she suggested. "Share essential items between our wagons." The idea caught on. The women began to work together, sharing resources. The Chun family, who had always traveled light, offered to carry extra baby supplies in their wagon. "We carry baby things," Mary's father said. "You carry food for sharing. Everyone helps everyone." It was a delicate negotiation, a web of mutual obligation. They were becoming more than a wagon train. They were becoming a single, interdependent organism. The real test came 3 days later at a place called Devil's Canyon. The trail became so narrow and steep that the wagons had to be lowered by rope down a sheer rock face. Eleanor watched in terror as the first wagon swayed dangerously on its slow descent. When it was her turn, she faced an impossible choice. The crib was too large to stay in the wagon, but carrying the babies down that treacherous path seemed just as risky. Then Daniel appeared. "I'll carry them," he said simply. "One at a time. It's the safest way." Eleanor stared at him. He was offering to risk his own life to save the children he had legally given away. The entire train would be risking its leader for 2 babies who were both their greatest hope and their heaviest burden. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure," he replied. The descent was 4 hours of pure terror. Daniel strapped Thomas to his chest in a carrier Mary had designed and began to climb down the rock face. The men above strained at the ropes, their knuckles white. He made it, then came back up for Elizabeth. Finally, he returned a 3rd time to help guide Eleanor's lightened wagon. When they were all safely at the bottom, the relief was so intense that some people simply collapsed in the snow. They had done it. They had proven they could function under the most extreme pressure, choosing the collective good over individual survival. That night, as they shared their meager rations, Eleanor looked at the twins, sleeping peacefully. Their survival had required the coordinated effort of every single person. Dr. Peterson checked on them. "They're thriving," he said. "But the next few weeks will test everyone's limits. We're entering territory where people die from exposure and starvation." As she settled into her own bedroll, listening to the quiet conversations around the fires, Eleanor realized her identity had been forged anew in this wilderness. She wasn't just a legal guardian anymore. She was a mother, in the deepest sense of the word, her instincts honed by constant danger. The community was strong, the babies were safe, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The blizzard hit without warning. It came on the morning they were supposed to attempt Eagle's Rest Pass, the last and most treacherous obstacle between them and California. Eleanor woke to a deafening silence, broken only by Elizabeth's muffled cries. Snow was piled 3 feet deep against their tent. The wind howled like a starving wolf. Thomas lay beside his sister, his breathing shallow, his lips tinged with blue. Both babies had been fighting another respiratory infection, their small bodies worn down by the altitude and cold. "We can't move in this," Rebecca whispered, her breath a white cloud in the frigid air of the tent. Mary Chun pushed through the flap, bringing a pot of steaming herbal tea. "My father says the storm will last 2, maybe 3 days," she said. "Some families are already talking about—" She trailed off, unable to say the words. But Eleanor knew. The wagon train had reached its breaking point. Their food was gone, except for a few days of emergency rations. The animals were dying. Trapped at 9,000 feet, they were facing the horrifying possibility that not everyone would make it. Dr. Peterson arrived, his face a mask of grief. "I lost 2 of the Henderson children during the night," he said quietly. "Pneumonia and exposure. Mrs. Carlton's baby won't make it through the day." Eleanor's world shrank to the tiny space inside the tent, to the 2 fragile lives hanging by a thread. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, but the brutal math of the mountains was unforgiving. "What can we do?" she asked, already knowing the answer. The doctor examined Thomas and Elizabeth. His expression grew more troubled. "They need warmth, rest, and nutrition," he said. "Things we cannot provide here. If we were in California, in a warm house, they would recover. But up here—" He didn't need to finish. The blizzard that had trapped them was slowly killing her children. That afternoon, Daniel called an emergency meeting. Eleanor left the babies with Rebecca and Mary and battled her way through the storm to the largest tent. 37 survivors huddled together, their faces gaunt. "We have food for 3 days," Samuel Morrison reported. "Fuel for 2. After that, we burn the wagons." Martha Wellington, her own face etched with grief, asked, "What about sending a party ahead for help?" "Suicide," Daniel said flatly. "No one could make it through the pass in this." The unspoken alternatives hung in the freezing air. They could wait and starve. They could try for the pass and freeze, or they could make the most terrible choice of all. James Mitchell, the blacksmith, finally gave it voice. "Some of us ain't gonna make it," he said, his voice rough. "We need to decide how to use what we've got left to save who we can." Triage. The word was a blade of ice in Eleanor's heart. They were talking about deciding who would live and who would die. Dr. Peterson spoke with a professional detachment that couldn't hide his pain. "The babies are the most vulnerable. They require the most resources and have the lowest probability of survival. From a purely practical standpoint—" "No." The word shot from Eleanor's lips, sharp and strong. "We don't make that choice. We don't decide some children are worth less than others." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "Eleanor, we may not have a choice. If caring for them means other children die, then we find another way, she insisted. We have solved every other impossible problem by working together. We will solve this one too. What followed was a desperate, frantic brainstorming session. The Chun family shared survival techniques from the harsh winters of northern China. Rebecca devised a way to modify the tents to conserve heat. Then, an unlikely hero spoke up. A quiet teenager named Tommy Rodriguez, who had cared for the horses. The animals, he said hesitantly. The ones that are dying. If we're not moving, maybe we could use them differently. The implication was horrific, but it was also their salvation. The dying oxen and horses were hundreds of pounds of meat. It meant abandoning the wagons, accepting that they would have to walk the rest of the way. But it meant living. We'd be on foot, Daniel said slowly, the military strategist in him calculating the odds. Carrying only what we can manage. With babies, Eleanor added. They can't walk. We take turns, Rebecca said instantly. All of us. While the blizzard raged, the wagon train transformed. The dying animals were slaughtered, their sacrifice honored. The meat was smoked and preserved. The wagons were dismantled, their wood used for fuel, their canvas and leather repurposed into backpacks and baby carriers. Every single adult took responsibility for the survival of Thomas and Elizabeth. Martha Wellington sewed her own coat into a carrier. Samuel Morrison crafted snowshoes. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the survivors emerged into a world of white. The wagons were gone. They were no longer a train, but a band of refugees, a single collective dedicated to one purpose: survival. Eleanor stood at the edge of the camp, holding Thomas, and looked up at the pass, a formidable wall of white against the blue sky. It's going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done, Daniel said, coming to stand beside her. And we're going to do it because these children represent everything we're fighting for, the future we're trying to build, the family we've become. Tears froze on Eleanor's cheeks. Catherine would be proud of the father you've become, she said softly. And she'd be amazed by the mother you've become, he replied. They had all been broken when this journey began, but by choosing to care for each other, they had created something unbreakable. Tomorrow they would climb. The ascent of Eagle's Rest Pass began at dawn. The air was so thin and cold, it felt like swallowing glass. Eleanor adjusted the ingenious baby carrier Mary and Samuel had designed. It distributed Thomas's weight across her back and shoulders, keeping him warm against her body. Behind her, Rebecca carried Elizabeth in a matching carrier. They looked like a desperate band of refugees, trudging through knee-deep snow, their faces wrapped in rags against the wind. Dr. Peterson had calculated it would take 14 hours of continuous climbing. 14 hours to climb 3,000 vertical feet in conditions that killed seasoned mountaineers. 2 hours in, Martha Wellington collapsed. Months of near starvation and a lingering lung infection had finally taken their toll. Daniel and Samuel lifted her between them, but it was clear they couldn't carry her and keep pace. I can take Elizabeth, Eleanor called out, her voice thin in the high altitude. Rebecca started to protest, but Eleanor was already adjusting her straps. The combined weight was staggering. 30 pounds of precious cargo that made every step a monumental effort. But Eleanor had found a strength she never knew she possessed. Mary Chun appeared at her side, pressing a walking stick into her hand. We walk together, she said. You carry babies, I carry your pack. A single thread makes no cloth. Those were the most grueling hours of Eleanor's life. Her muscles screamed. The babies cried, their wails echoing in the vast empty space. But as they climbed, something incredible happened. The last vestiges of selfishness dissolved. James Mitchell, the blacksmith, took turns carrying the babies without being asked. Mrs. Henderson shared her last bit of hoarded energy food. Tommy Rodriguez, the quiet teenager, emerged as their guide. He had an intuitive understanding of the mountain, finding safer paths, pointing out hidden dangers. "There," he called out, pointing to a series of ledges. "Longer, but safer." Daniel studied the route. "Good eye, son," he said. And Eleanor heard the word, son, and realized the family they were building was bigger than she had ever imagined. At the midpoint of the climb, they could see it, the green valleys of California, spread out below like a promised land. But to get there, they had to cross a section of trail called the Narrows. A knife-edge ridge, 4 feet wide, with a 1,000-foot drop on either side. The wind howled across it, threatening to tear them from the mountain. "We rope together," Daniel announced. "No one crosses alone. If one falls, the group holds them." They became a human chain, moving slowly, deliberately. Eleanor was in the middle, Mary in front of her, Rebecca behind. She focused only on her feet, one in front of the other, ignoring the terrifying abyss on either side. Thomas shifted in his carrier, and she whispered to him, her words as much for herself as for him. "Almost there," Mary called back. 50 more steps." And on step 37, Rebecca stumbled. Eleanor felt the rope jerk tight, pulling her backward toward the edge. For one heart-stopping second, she was suspended over the void, Rebecca's weight dragging her down. She heard Rebecca scream, felt Elizabeth's carrier slam into her back. Then Tommy Rodriguez, just behind Rebecca, dug in. With impossible strength, he arrested his own fall and hauled Rebecca back onto the trail. He saved 4 lives in an instant. When they reached the other side, Eleanor collapsed, shaking, the baby still strapped to her. Rebecca was sobbing with relief. Mary checked the carriers. "They're fine," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Both sleeping, like nothing happened." Dr. Peterson declared them past the most dangerous part, only 3 hours of climbing left. As they pushed on, Eleanor thought about what had just happened. Tommy's heroism, the rope that held them together. They were no longer individuals. They were a single organism, and its sole purpose was to protect its young. Near the summit, the altitude became punishing. The babies grew distressed in the thin air. But then, they saw it, a thread of smoke rising from a chimney in the valley below. They heard the faint sound of church bells on the wind. Civilization, safety, the end. When Eleanor finally stepped onto the windswept summit, she was overwhelmed. Behind them, 5 months of unimaginable hardship. Ahead, the promised land. Thomas woke up and gave her a brilliant, toothless smile. "We did it," Rebecca whispered. "We actually did it." Daniel came to stand beside her. "Catherine would be so proud," he said quietly, "of what we've all become." Eleanor looked at the 31 survivors. They had learned how to be a family. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's the beginning." As they started their descent toward the warmth and safety of the valley, Thomas's tiny hand gripped her finger. The mountain was conquered. The real adventure was about to begin. 3 years later, Eleanor Phillips stood on the porch of the largest house in New Haven Valley. In the garden below, Thomas and Elizabeth played, healthy and confident 4-year-olds who had never known fear. The valley that had welcomed 31 starving survivors was now a thriving community of over 200. The desperate survival tactics they had learned in the mountains had become their guiding principles. They had built a society based not on individual gain, but on cooperation. "Mama Eleanor," Thomas called out. "Come see Elizabeth's pictures." Eleanor smiled. She was Mama Eleanor, not just to her own children, but to a dozen others who lived in their extended household. The legal adoption papers signed in Missouri felt like a relic from another lifetime. Down in the garden, Elizabeth stood at her easel. Her painting showed their settlement, not as a collection of individual houses, but as a network of shared spaces, communal kitchens, workshops, a school. She had captured the very soul of their community. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Eleanor said. Just then, Dr. Peterson walked up from the clinic he had established. At 63, he was a legend in California, a pioneer of community health. "Eleanor, I have remarkable news," he said, his eyes twinkling. "The territorial government wants to study what we've built here. They're calling it the New Haven experiment. They think it might be the future of Western development." Eleanor felt a familiar sense of awe. The desperate act that had saved 2 babies had somehow blossomed into a model for a new kind of society. Their infant mortality rate was 0. Their literacy rates were higher than in Boston. Their cooperative economy had created a prosperity that was shared by all. Mary Chun came out of the house, holding her own daughter, a toddler named Catherine. Mary was now married to Tommy Rodriguez, the quiet teenager who had saved them on the mountain. Together, they ran the New Haven School, a place renowned for its innovative approach to cross-cultural education. "The afternoon classes are starting," Mary said. "Elizabeth, are you ready to help with the art lesson?" Eleanor watched as her 4-year-old daughter seriously took on the role of assistant teacher. Rebecca Foster arrived from the workshops, her arms full of textiles she designed, using techniques learned from Mary's family and their Native American neighbors. She was married now to Samuel Morrison, and together they ran New Haven's most successful business enterprise. "The Pawnee delegation arrived this morning," Rebecca reported. "They want to establish formal trade agreements." The warriors who had once seemed so threatening were now their partners, their friends. "Where's Daniel?" Eleanor asked. "He's at the new settlement site," Mary replied, "helping the latest group of families understand our principles." Daniel Harrison had become their ambassador, traveling throughout California, sharing their story. He was still Papa Daniel to the twins, not their legal father, but a loving, protective presence in their lives. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey: the broken soldier, the childless widow, the orphan twins. Every person who had survived that trip had discovered a purpose they never knew they had. James Mitchell was their master craftsman. Mrs. Henderson, who had lost 2 of her own children, had become a fierce advocate for child welfare, influencing law across the territory. That evening, as they all gathered for their communal meal, Daniel made an announcement. "The territorial governor has invited us to send representatives to the Constitutional Convention. They want New Haven's voice to be heard as California applies for statehood." The room fell silent. Their small experiment was being invited to help shape the future of a state. "The governor specifically requested Eleanor," Daniel said. Eleanor was stunned. "I can't do it alone," she said finally. "If I go, I need Mary and Rebecca with me. This community's success comes from all of us." Later that night, she and Daniel stood on the porch, looking out at the peaceful valley. "Do you ever wonder what Catherine would think?" Eleanor asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "I think she'd be amazed by the children you've raised," he said, a genuine peace in his voice. "And grateful that her death led to something so much larger than any of us could have imagined." Their story had become more than just their own. It was proof that broken people could build unbreakable communities, that families forged in fire are the strongest of all. Inside the house, Thomas and Elizabeth slept, safe and loved. Outside, New Haven stood as a beacon of hope. They had come west seeking gold, but they had found something far more valuable: the knowledge that the greatest strength of humanity is its capacity to turn loss into hope and survival into a thriving, joyful life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.